Good morning. So this is chapter 2 of American environmental history. And in this chapter, we're going to look at the cultures of the Americas, which developed separately from the cultures of Europe and Asia, because the American people were separated from their Eurasian cousins for about 12,000 years. And in this chapter, we'll explore what happened to these people when the Europeans finally arrived and, quote unquote, discovered the Americas. This first image that you'll be seeing is a navigational map that was drawn circa 1490 in the workshop of a couple of guys by the name of Bartolomeo and Cristoforo Colombo. The second one, of course, is the one that we know as Christopher Columbus. His brother, Bartolomeo, actually went with him to the West Indies and became a governor of colonies there. But we'll get to that part. Now, we all learned as children that Columbus discovered America on October 12th, 1492, really just after midnight, I think. But as we discussed in the last chapter, important human interactions with the American environment had been going on for millennia by that time, by the time that Europeans made their way to what they called the New World. In recent years, some historians have retold the traditional story of European exploration with an emphasis on the brutality of groups like the conquistadors. Indian activists have called for boycotts of Columbus Day and of Thanksgiving. Our goal here isn't really to choose sides, but to recognize environmental factors that influenced the course of these events. Some of these factors were introduced in the last chapter. Of course, the shapes and the placement of continents on our planet and the climate changes surrounding the ice ages influenced the development of civilizations in both Eurasia and in the Americas. In this chapter, we'll examine how less obvious environmental factors, such as the distribution of animal species and the ways that humans changed when they first domesticated animals, also had a major impact on history when Europeans began sailing ships across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, as you're probably aware, the early morning arrival of Christopher Columbus's little fleet of 3 ships in the fall of 1492 has been frequently challenged as the first contact between Europeans and the Americas. Some claims of first contact are better supported by evidence than others. One of the best documented happened nearly 5 centuries before Columbus's arrival, and that would be the arrival of the Vikings. At the northern tip of Newfoundland, there's a Canadian provincial park called L'Anse aux Meadows. It's built on the site of an ancient Viking settlement. The Norse have for a long time told an old legend that the Viking hero Leif Erikson founded a colony in a new land that he called Vinland. The discovery of this Norse village in 1960 and its acceptance as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1978 established this Newfoundland colony as the oldest known European site in the Americas, and very probably as the Vinland settlement of the Norse legends, validating those old stories. The Canadian ruins date from the appropriate period, around 1000 of the Common Era. Artifacts found in the remains of 8 buildings include farm implements and blacksmith tools. There's also a spinning room containing a soapstone spindle and some stone weights that were probably part of a loom. The presence of these artifacts suggests that the settlement probably included women, and possibly even families. In other words, the Newfoundland site seems to have been a permanent colony rather than merely a seasonal fishing camp. It was probably an extension of the permanent Viking settlements on Greenland that were the home of Leif Erikson's father, Eric the Red. This image here is called Summer. It's a painting called Summer on the Greenland Coast, circa the year 1000. And it was painted by a painter named Rasmussen around 1890. And it suggests the danger of crossing the North Atlantic in little ships. And it suggests the tenacity of the Vikings sailing in these frigid Arctic waters. Now, Norse legends say that the Vinland colonists were attacked by vicious natives that the Vikings called Skraelings, which suggests that the native Newfoundland population resisted the newcomers fairly effectively. The Norse also traded with the natives, who were very interested in the milk that the Vikings offered. Cattle were not indigenous to North America, and the presence of cow's milk on the Vinland settlement is another indication that it was a long-term colony rather than a temporary camp, because obviously they would have had to bring those cattle with them on ships. This map, drawn in 1570 in the town of Scaleholt in Iceland, shows Great Britain at the bottom right, Iceland in the center, and on the left, Grönlandia, Greenland. And then below that, Helleland, the land of flat stones, Markland, the land of forests, and Skrælingland, which a note in the text that accompanied the map actually says was close to Vinland, the land of meadows and vines. The forests of Markland would have been especially interesting to explorers from Greenland, because the Norse settlements in Greenland obviously lacked trees for building, because there were no forests in Greenland at that time. The scarcity of additional Norse sites and the fact that we're all not speaking Norwegian today remind us that the Vikings failed to sustain their settlement in Greenland. We can probably attribute this failure partly to the resistance of the Skraelings. But another decisive factor was a change in global climate. In the middle of the 14th century, a 400-year period of global cooling, known as the Little Ice Age, began. Scientists have measured the effects of this climate change in tree rings as far away as Patagonia. Changes in temperature and weather were noticed and recorded in Mayan and Aztec chronicles, and also in European chronicles and in paintings that depicted, for example, Londoners drinking, dancing, and skating on the frozen River Thames. The Thames doesn't freeze nowadays. Pack ice in the North Atlantic expanded southward, making travel to America much more difficult and much more dangerous. Greenland's glaciers advanced, and the shortened growing seasons threatened the 500-year-old Viking settlements there. By the early 1400s, the Norse had abandoned these settlements, and without Greenland, it was impossible, really, to sustain a colony in Vinland. This map is a 1747 map called Old Greenland, and it mentions that the coastline where settlements had once been located had become inaccessible due to what the map calls floating and fixed mountains of ice. The map even includes the location of a legendary strait, a waterway through the center of Greenland, that was believed to have once allowed travelers to sail right through the center of Greenland to the North American side. But the map says that this had become shut up with ice. It's interesting to speculate what American history would look like today if the Vikings hadn't been defeated by the Skraelings and by climate change. Even during the Little Ice Age, though, Europeans continued to venture into the icy North Atlantic, and many probably sailed most of the way, if not all the way, to the New World. Basque fishing fleets, for example, began crossing the North Atlantic to visit the Grand Banks in the middle of the 15th century, so the mid-1400s. The banks are areas of shallow water on the continental shelf at the edge of North America, which were warmed by the Gulf Stream. And these warm, shallow waters are an ideal home for bottom-feeding, bottom-dwelling species like cod and lobster. Whoever first discovered the rich fisheries of the Grand Banks off of Newfoundland and George's Bank off of Cape Cod, by the late 1400s, thousands of Europeans were crossing the ocean to take advantage of this bounty. The Venetian explorer Giovanni Caboto, who anglicized his name to John Cabot, reported in 1497 that the Grand Banks cod were so numerous and abundant that you could almost walk across the water's surface on their backs. Now, cod had been fished in the North Atlantic at least since that period of Viking exploration, from 800 to 1000. The Vikings and the Basques used similar techniques, actually, catching fish close to shore and then bringing them ashore and drying them on wooden racks that were assembled on nearby beaches. They probably landed regularly on the coastlines of North America near the fishing grounds to dry fish and also to replenish their supplies of fresh water before setting off for home. And while the locations of these prime fishing grounds were originally closely guarded trade secrets, by the late 1400s, the Portuguese had found out and had begun sending their own fleets to the Grand Banks. Salted cod is still an important element of Portuguese cuisine, although nowadays they get their fish from Norway. Until their defeat as part of the Spanish Armada in 1588, Portugal was actually a North Atlantic naval power. And in the early 1480s, Christopher Columbus was a sailor off the West African coast, where he regularly visited the Portuguese trading post at Elmina. Columbus's home base was in Lisbon, and his wife, a woman named Filipa Moniz Perestrelo, was the daughter of the Portuguese governor of the island of San Porto, which is an island off the Atlantic coast of North Africa. It's very possible that Columbus first heard of the New World from Portuguese sailors retelling the stories of Basque fishermen who had gone out to the Grand Banks. This image here is a copy of the Travels of Marco Polo, which was printed by Gutenberg as one of the first books that Gutenberg printed on his new movable type press. And these are Christopher Columbus's handwritten notes in the margins. By the end of the 15th century, Europe was recovering from the Black Death, the bubonic plague that had killed between 100 million and 200 million people about 150 years earlier. Fish from the Grand Banks helped feed these growing populations, and Europe entered a period of economic and cultural growth that we know as the Renaissance. Merchants were reminded of the existence of the wealthy empires, Asian empires in India and China, and they began taking advantage of trade routes, such as the Silk Road. The German blacksmith, Gutenberg, developed that printing press, which allowed Columbus to read the Travels of Marco Polo as a young man in Genoa. And then the Italian learned to sail and became a navigator, working the Atlantic coast off of Africa. In 1492, Columbus convinced the monarchs of a newly unified Spain to finance a mission to discover a sea route to China. King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile had just combined their kingdoms and their armies and completed the Reconquista, driving the Muslims out of the Iberian Peninsula after nearly 800 years of war. And it's vital to our understanding of Spanish America to remember that the new Iberian nation that then turned its attention to exploration in 1492 had been pretty much constantly at war since the Middle Ages. Now, as you would expect, it's very difficult to be certain about the exact population of the world at the end of the 15th century. There are a number of competing estimates, but the consensus is that there were probably about 500 million people alive in 1492, and that slightly over a third of them lived in Asia. The other 2/3 seem to have been about evenly split between Europe, Africa, and the Americas, although there's still a great deal of controversy surrounding those numbers. Even so, if we take a conservative number from the middle of the range of estimates, we get an American population of 80 to 100 million just before Columbus and his fellow explorers began arriving. All but about 2 or 3 million of those Native Americans lived in Central and in South America, which were much more densely populated at this point than North America was. Now, Columbus arrived in the Caribbean in October of 1492, and he explored until late December. His flagship, the Santa Maria, ran aground on Hispaniola on December 25th and had to be abandoned. With permission of the local chief, Columbus left 39 sailors behind in a settlement that he named La Navidad, because it happened on Christmas. He returned to Europe with 2 ships, a few Indians, some gold, and specimens of native species, including turkeys, pineapple, and tobacco. He arrived in Barcelona in mid-March and was celebrated as a hero. It's often mentioned that Columbus believed that he had reached Asia, and he did sort of make that claim in a very extravagant letter on the first voyage that he wrote. But this letter was really the explorer's report to his royal sponsors, and he wanted very badly to be sent back again. Columbus wrote, "Hispaniola is a miracle, both fertile and beautiful. The harbors are unbelievably good, and there are many wide rivers, the majority of which contain gold." Whether or not Columbus understood that he was reporting on previously unknown lands, he definitely got people excited about the places that he visited. And when other explorers reached America, they were equally amazed. People throughout Europe read exciting travelers' accounts, like Amerigo Vespucci's 1504 bestseller, Mundus Novus, which means New World, and actually coined the term New World, and made it clear for anybody who might still be confused that these lands were not Asia, but were a previously unknown continent. Like Columbus, the explorers carried back to Europe not only stories of wealthy civilizations and legends of cities of gold, but samples of native plants and animals and captive Indians. And when Columbus himself returned to the Caribbean, he brought with him European plants and animals that he transplanted into this promising new environment. Europeans realized that not only were American food crops useful and could be brought back to Europe, but also that the Americas would be a great place to grow many of Europe's traditional foods. Columbus returned to the Caribbean in 1495 with 17 ships, 1,200 men, and according to his diaries, seeds and cuttings for the planting of wheat, chickpeas, melons, onions, radishes, salad greens, grapevines, sugarcane, and fruit stones for the founding of orchards. Other Old World crops that arrived in the Americas included coffee and bananas, which were brought from the Canary Islands in 1516. The Spanish had introduced sugar cultivation to the Canary Islands in the 15th century, so it only made sense to try to plant sugar in this tropical paradise that the explorers had discovered across the Atlantic. Cattle were delivered to Spanish conquistadors in Mexico in 1521. And by 1614, less than 100 years later, according to one of the conquistador chronicles, the residents of Santiago, which is in Chile, 4,000 miles away, possessed 39,250 head of cattle, as well as flocks totaling over 623,000 sheep. So, according to local traditions, when Pizarro first invaded Peru in 1524, he crossed the Andes with only 80 fighting men and only 40 horses, but with over 2,000 pigs. The armies traveled with their food in those days. So most of the really significant Eurasian species brought to the Americas had already been introduced by the Spanish by the early 1500s, long before North American settlement began. Even species like the wild horses of the American West that would transform Plains Indian culture were escapees from the herds of the conquistadors. As I mentioned earlier, the Americans were home to very few large mammal species after the Holocene extinction, and most could not be domesticated. Domestication only works with social animals that will accept a human as the leader of their herd or their pack. Nearly all the species that humans have successfully domesticated, the familiar residents of the modern farmyard, originated in Europe and Asia. These include goats, sheep, cows, horses, pigs, and chickens. Eurasians began domesticating these animals between 10 and 15,000 years ago. This was just a little bit too late for the Beringians to bring domesticated animals with them into North America. And in any case, the Beringians, if you recall, were tundra hunters, not temperate zone pastoralists. But of course, as any good hunter would, the Beringians had brought their dogs along with them. Now, historians call this transfer of plants and animals that began with the 15th and early 16th century European-American contact. They call this the Columbian Exchange. The directions of these transfers and their effects on the environments and people of both Europe and of the Americas shaped the modern world that we live in. American maize and potatoes and cassava fed European and Asian populations and allowed those populations to grow and allowed the building of new cities and new industries. European animals, such as pigs and sheep and chicken and cattle, thrived in the Americas in basically empty ecological niches, allowing both natives and Europeans to expand and to change their cultures. But the most significant change of all was the largely accidental transfer of viruses and bacteria from Europeans to Americans, which caused the deaths of possibly 90% of the Native American population. This image is variola major, the smallpox virus, magnified 370,000 times using an electron microscope. When prehistoric Eurasians began living in close contact with these species that they domesticated between 10 and 15,000 years ago, the people changed as well as the animals. We've already noted how Europeans and some Africans developed a mutation that allowed them to digest cow's milk. Another change domesticated animals brought to humans, which was largely unrecognized by historians until recently, was disease. Most of humanity's major diseases originated in animals and crossed from domesticated species to their human keepers. Whooping cough and influenza came from pigs. Measles and smallpox came from cattle, and malaria and the avian flu came from chickens. The people who domesticated these species and lived with the animals for generations co-evolved with them. Animal diseases became survivable when people developed antibodies and immunities. Without inheriting this protection, even a routine childhood disease, such as chickenpox, can be totally devastating. The introduction of a disease into an area without any immunity is called a virgin soil epidemic. And such epidemics had happened in Eurasia. For example, when the Romans spread smallpox into the populations that they conquered. And they had happened in Europe when the expanding Mongols introduced bubonic plague. The Black Death, which I mentioned earlier, killed probably half the population of Europe in the 14th century, reducing world population by over 100 million. Virgin soil epidemics happened in the Americas when explorers and colonists introduced Eurasian diseases to Native Americans who had been isolated from Europeans and Asians for thousands of years. The Americans had no immunities, and even diseases that were no longer particularly deadly to Europeans killed millions of Americans. The Eurasian diseases that attacked native populations included smallpox, measles, chickenpox, influenza, typhus, cholera, diphtheria, typhoid, bubonic plague, scarlet fever, whooping cough, and malaria. This illustration is from a book called the Florentine Codex. It was written about 1540, and it shows Aztec people suffering from smallpox and transmitting the disease by coughing. The impact of these Eurasian diseases on Americans was one of human history's most severe population disasters. Even the Black Death didn't kill as large a percentage of Europeans as these diseases killed. in America. For example, there were probably 1 million people living on that Caribbean island of Hispaniola in 1492 when Columbus left his 39 sailors in La Navidad. By 1548, there were only 500 natives left alive. The populations of other Caribbean islands were similarly wiped out. Whole civilizations disappeared. And this was not only a tragedy for the cultures that vanished, it began a cycle of violence that became central to American history. Because once there were no longer any natives left to work on European sugar plantations, African slaves became crucial to the survival of the West Indies economy. This is a 1524 map of Tenochtitlan, the city built by the Aztecs in Lake Texcoco that was conquered by Cortez and renamed Mexico City. The greater population densities of Central and South America helped contagious diseases spread much more quickly there. Heavily traveled roads and trade routes in central Mexico actually spread disease beyond the areas that had been reached by Spanish explorers. Cities were wiped out that had never even seen a white man. The population of the Aztec heartland dropped from about 25 million people on the eve of the Spanish conquest in 1519 to just under 17 million a decade later. Excuse me. That means that 1 out of every 3 people died in just 10 years. Another decade, and the Aztec population was reduced to about 6 million. 3 out of 4 people in the Aztec world disappeared in 20 years. Imagine writing a list of all the people you know, all your friends and relatives, and then randomly crossing out 3 out of every 4 names. By 1580, the Aztec Empire had been hollowed out to less than 2 million people from its starting point of 25 million. Isolated rural communities may have been a little bit luckier than central cities on trade routes. The central cities were often completely emptied. The city of Zempoala, for example, held 100,000 Aztec citizens in 1519. There were only 25 native inhabitants of Zempoala in 1550. This is a European painting of Hernan Cortez's 1521 conquest of Tenochtitlan. The Spaniards are crossing one of the causeways across the lake to reach the city. And this has traditionally been depicted as a heroic victory for Spain. Actually, Cortez was defeated and he was driven from the city. And he only succeeded after a 2-month-long smallpox epidemic weakened the Aztec defenders. And then he and his allies were able to come back in. The Inca Empire in the Andes suffered pretty much the same fate. 90% of the South Americans died. And they started dying before white men arrived, which caused confusion and dismay. When Pizarro crossed the Andes with his 80 conquistadors and 60 horses and 2,000 pigs, he found social chaos. Huayna Capac, the Inca leader who had extended the empire to its greatest extent into Chile and Ecuador, had died of smallpox. His 2 sons then fought a brutal civil war for control of the empire. The younger son, Atahualpa, finally defeating and assassinating his older brother, Huáscar, with Pizarro's help. The war and the weakness of the reduced Inca population and the social confusion gave Pizarro the opportunity that he needed to capture and then kill Atahualpa himself in 1533, effectively ending the Inca Empire. Hernando de Soto landed an expedition in Florida after helping Pizarro. He landed an expedition in Florida in 1539, and he explored territory now in the states of Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, and Oklahoma. So the entire Southeast, really. Everywhere he went, the conquistador reported that the land was, quote, thickly settled with large towns, end quote. De Soto didn't stay long. He died of fever in Louisiana in 1542. And then the region wasn't visited again by Europeans until a French aristocrat by the name of La Salle traveled down the Mississippi River in 1670. Where De Soto had seen fortified towns, La Salle saw nobody. The entire region was empty, and the French explorer traveled hundreds of miles without passing a single village. Historians were actually unaware until recently that the American South had once been heavily populated with natives before the arrival of contagious European explorers and Spanish conquistadors and missionaries. The destruction of these native empires and the rapid disappearance of the American population was unplanned. The overwhelming success of the conquistadors was an unanticipated consequence of this recontact between these two isolated human descendant groups of those original Eurasian plains hunters that we talked about in the last chapter. 16th century Europeans had virtually no understanding of the causes of disease. They had no idea that exploring the Americas or carrying their animals to the New World would eliminate 9 out of 10 people in the population that had once been the size of Europe's. But they did know how to take advantage of their enemies' misfortunes. The rapid destruction of American populations and cultures created opportunities for opportunistic Europeans to colonize the Americas that they wouldn't have otherwise have enjoyed. We'll take a closer look at this colonization in the next chapter. But in the meantime, let's go back and look at what happened to Europe. As I had previously mentioned, American staple crops, maize and potatoes and cassava, were introduced in Europe, where they sparked a population boom. Many plant species developed by Americans are still crucial to the world economy, including not only maize and potatoes and cassava, but also tomatoes, sweet potatoes, cocoa, chili peppers, natural rubber, tobacco, and vanilla. Quinine, a medicine made from the bark of the Peruvian cinchona tree, was effective in treating malaria. And that helped open the tropics to European colonization, not only in the Americas, but all over the world. Eurasian plants like sugar and soybeans and oranges and bananas and rice, which probably reached America from Africa, along with enslaved women who were experts in growing it. These crops also were extensively cultivated in the Americas for shipment back to European commercial markets. Exports of native and transplanted crops helped to feed growing cities and freed up European workers to begin working in new industries. Without American foods, there might have been no European Industrial Revolution. The other American product that rapidly was sent across the Atlantic to Europe and then across the Pacific to Asia was money. Although Europeans never found El Dorado, the legendary Indian city of gold, they did find a fair amount of gold, and they found even more silver. For example, the Bolivian city of Potosi, which is located in the Andes Mountains at an elevation of 13,420 feet, Potosi is said to be the world's highest city. Potosi was established by the Spanish in 1542 on the site of a long-standing native mining village at the foot of a mountain called the Cerro Rico, which is literally a mountain of silver. Potosi has a current population of about 165,000. And that's interesting because it's almost identical to Potosi's population in 1660, when the mining city was larger than Seville, Madrid, or Rome. And when the combined population of all of North America, all the colonies in North America, was less than about 75,000. So this was a big city. Spanish silver coins that are often called pieces of 8 from the Cerro Rico and from similar mines in Zacatecas, Mexico, were so plentiful that they became the international currency for Europe and much of Asia. And once again, without the money minted in Latin America at these mines, there might have been no global commercial boom to finance the Industrial Revolution. And Potosi's story isn't over yet. Although most of the silver was taken out of the mountain centuries ago, the Cerro Rico isn't done being worked. It's currently being worked by Bolivian children, whose story is told in an award-winning documentary called The Devil's Miner, which you can view on the web if you're interested in learning more. So as a result of the Columbian Exchange, European colonists in the Americas frequently found fields waiting for their farmers and herds of game animals waiting for their hunters. They thought this was paradise. In Central and South America, the Spanish built cities like Mexico City and Cusco right on top of the native cities that they replaced. Since Spanish colonists were generally soldiers, conquistadors, and very few Spanish women came to the early colonies, there was a lot of racial mixing. Most of the countries of Latin America are built on mixed or mestizo populations. So much so that it actually became important for the colonists to try to make distinctions between all the various types of people that they believed made up their societies. Although these distinctions were initially used to uphold the power of the group on top, the people of pure Spanish blood, in the long run, many of these Euro-American populations have developed strong ethnic identities. A similar process happened to our north in New France. There are only about 2,500 people in French Quebec, only about 2,500 French people in Quebec by 1663. And most of them were voyageurs, the fur traders who went into the northern forests to trap beaver and make their fortunes. The voyageurs married local Indian women, and their Canadian descendants are now recognized as a distinct ethnic group called Métis. This is an 18th century Spanish Casta painting, and it describes all the various different varieties of racial mixing and suggests the social consequences of that. In the Dutch and English colonies, in contrast, that became the United States, the races kept mostly separate. Many settlers in early U.S. history migrated with their entire families to settle the British colonies. But the racial segregation that developed in the colonies that became the United States was not inevitable. If the people who had settled the U.S. had mixed a little bit more with the natives, genetically and culturally, would our culture and our relationship with our environment have been different? Something to think about until we return next time to look at North American colonialism. So, hope that was useful. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.